Okay, Dr. Vejar, why is curiosity so important?
That's a really good question. And first of all, I appreciate your curiosity and learning more about curiosity.
Not a
Um,
problem.
it takes a curious person to want to ask these questions. So I think that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So curiosity is a tremendous resource that oftentimes we don't really talk about. We talk about other important resources, internal resources like intelligence. We talk about external resources that impact our lives like financial security. But curiosity is also something that we use every single day. Oftentimes, when we think about curiosity, we think about it kind of in the big picture. We think about ingenuity and we think about, scientific discovery, which of course utilizes curiosity. And that really leads to innovation, which is very important at the macro level. But in our day to day, curiosity is equally just as important. So think about, for example, um, think about how curiosity can lend itself to resilience. So let's say, for example, somebody is really unhappy at their station of life, and they are unhappy at their job. For instance, and they think, well, this is what I've always done. This is what I went to school for, and I've been in this field for X amount of years. And so sometimes that persistence can be a positive quality too, but sometimes the curiosity to see things a little different. Well, what would my life look like if I slightly tilt or shift the kaleidoscope and I look at things in a different way, or I explore something new? And so in our day-to-day life, we can use curiosity to kind of increase our satisfaction, our happiness. It can help with resolving conflicts, curiosity, maybe to understand somebody else's perspective when we're in arguments. So really, I think that curiosity is a resource that we should look at that really helps us fuel our lives and helps us function in fulfilling ways.
Yeah, exactly. Now, obviously you did mention quite a bit there, which will break down each one and then we'll just dive into each of it because I think it's obviously really important. And then you mentioned that oftentimes, financial security or being smart and intelligent is something that people tend to value quite a bit, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's also pretty interesting because oftentimes you become more financially secure and more intelligent by being curious and asking questions that people don't really ask, right? Which gives you a completely different perspective on things, which again makes you look smarter or, makes you richer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, most human beings or almost all human beings are naturally really curious when they're young, right? Like if
Mm-hmm.
you look at kids, I mean, that's just what they do. Like they're just so curious. They ask random questions. But people tend to lose that as they get older, right? Why is that? Because like you don't have to teach a kid to be curious. They're just naturally like that. So why do we lose that as human beings as we get older?
Yeah, that's a really good question too. So anytime we engage with kids, it's really interesting because you're looking at children who are almost taking in the world for the very first time. Everything is new to them. I remember, I used to work with young kids when I was younger, and I also have kids. And I
Mhm.
remember being fascinated when I would hold up, just maybe even a regular, like kids sometimes like to play with pots and pans. And you think, oh, what's so fun and fandangled about pots and pans? But everything is new to them. The whole big world is new, and they haven't seen this before. They haven't seen this shape. When you introduce new toys to infants, and so they're taking everything in for the first time, and so that curiosity almost naturally occurs whenever we engage with something that's novel or new. But then over time, as we grow up and become adults, there's less and less that becomes new and,
Mhm.
um, you know, exciting. We've seen it all. We've done it all. I mean, of course, we haven't done it all, but, in our day to day lives,
Yeah.
when we step outside of the door to go to work, let's say, we're not stepping into this big world and, oh, look at that grass. It's amazing. We've seen that grass a million times before. And so we almost get stuck in this like hamster wheel of routine. And to some degree, that's positive because that predictability offers stability. And, we need a certain level of stability and predictability in our worlds to just make it function and make it make sense. But alongside of that, we do lose some of that wonder and some of that, magic in terms of being engaged with things that are new and novel. Aside from maybe if somebody does something extravagant, like goes on a trip that they've never been to before, there's not a whole lot of newness that many people have in their day-to-day lives. And so really the curiosity is replaced with, I guess, predictability and sometimes even stagnancy in terms of like, okay, it feels very rote, and sometimes to the nth degree, it might feel like we're in a rut and things just become very almost too predictable or too bland.
Yeah, exactly. Now, what can people do to break out of that? Because, sometimes they kind of go towards unhealthy sources of stimulation, right? To, I guess, find excitement or just to be entertained, right? So, like, what would you like? What questions should people start to ask themselves if they've kind of realized, hey, my curiosity has somewhat died, these past few years or even past, a few like decades, right? What can people do? Like, what questions should they start asking to really break out of that mold?
Well, I think one interesting exercise that people can do is so we talked about how children are kind of naturally curious and they naturally have kind of that spark of just navigating through something that feels so different. And so in some ways we can try to kind of return to that childlike wonder, and even maybe reflect on ourselves when we were younger. Like for what I like to ask people to do sometimes is think of what did you want to be when you were young, when you were 8 years old? What did you want to be? And we, as adults, we look at that and we think, oh, it's maybe a fun memory, but it seems nonsensical. Like, let's say, for example, you wanted to be a race car driver. And, of course, that is an existing profession, but, maybe your life didn't lead in that direction. And so at this point, you think, oh, that seems silly. Well, could there be some quality within that maybe you incorporate into your life now? And so really trying to kind of connect with maybe that child version of yourself, but in an appropriate adult-like manner. So for example, when I was young, I wanted to be a detective. And, I didn't. I became a counselor and a professor. But I try to go back and think, well, what qualities were appealing to me back then, and how might I connect with them? And so just kind of being curious about looking even at your own self through the different phases that you've gone through in the different chapters can sometimes really kind of peel back interesting layers and help you engage with life in a different manner.
God, yeah. So that's pretty interesting. So, like, what qualities did you see? I guess if you want to give people like an example that they could, follow, what qualities did you see between being a detective and being a counselor that kind of allowed you to connect both together and, obviously find fulfillment? Like, what were those qualities that you found?
Yeah, great question. So can you hear me, by the way? Because I think the connection was a little you froze there for a second. I think it's back there. Okay.
Yeah, like it lagged for like 2 seconds.
Yes.
No problem.
So when I was little, I remember I used to get on my bicycle and ride through the streets of Torrance, California, where I lived at the time. And I would kind of just make up these little stories like, oh, I see this person's garage open and now it's closed. And I would make up these little stories like the case of the missing, the car, somebody took their car and I wonder what happened. And I would kind of engage creatively. I wasn't making things up and like, tattletaling on people, but just I knew it was a game, and I liked to really engage with my imagination and my curiosity and my creativity. And so I feel like I've carried some of that creativity, and I love creating stories. I love writing. I love thinking outside of the box. Also, as when I think of being a detective and my younger self on like a 10-speed bike zooming through the neighborhood, I was really curious and I wanted to learn more about my surroundings. And now I feel like, as both an academic and as a counselor, I feel like primarily that's what I do is I either study social phenomenon, I'm curious about something and I want to know more about it, or as a counselor, I'm really fascinated with human beings and the human condition. And so I'm still kind of exercising some of those characteristics, although not as a detective, but I feel like they're still alive and well in me.
Yeah, exactly. So, that whole idea of making up stories in your head, most adults can't resonate with that at all nowadays because like as you mentioned, as you get older you kind of lose that quality, right? But
Mm-hmm.
it's so cool, like as a kid, like you're making up a world in your head. And also your your love for learning about people is pretty
Mm-hmm.
much what connects both of them, right?
Yes.
Now, in order to do that, you have to be really open-minded. If you're too
Yes.
rigid, you're not even going to engage in that thought process. It's not possible, right? So if you wanted to help people become more open-minded, which again is something that they tend to lose as they get older, how would you help them down that path? Like, what can people do to become more open-minded?
So I think the first thing that people can do is start engaging with things that are different from them. And, that sometimes for some people that sounds scary, and for some people that sounds really exciting. And so if it sounds scary, I would say to start off very small. So maybe try new foods, or, if you watch movies or read books, try a new genre. Or even as a step beyond that, I would say start engaging in ideas that are different than your own. So we live in a society right now that is very polarized. And oftentimes people live in echo chambers and they surround themselves with people who are very similar minded to them. I don't think that's a new phenomenon, but we see it kind of, I think, pronounced with the social media and so forth. And, people just, kind of surround themselves in these insular communities and insular mindsets is what I'll say. And so proactively stepping outside of that and maybe talking to people who have different political beliefs as yours, or start watching podcasts that are, podcasts like yours, where you're exploring the human condition, or podcasts that might represent a different mindset than your own. Like, let's say you have a certain political background and you watch somebody who's the exact opposite of yours. And I think that really starts the wheels turning. The idea isn't that you're going to engage with these different ideas so that you all of a sudden change your mind. But the idea is just to really understand different thought patterns instead of wanting just the same. So let's stick with maybe a political conversation. Oftentimes when two people come together
Mm.
and they have very different politics, we think of a fight escalating, or a very heated conversation. But instead of that, maybe lean into curiosity and say, well, that's such a different idea than I have. What would make somebody have that value? What would make somebody have that belief? I'm really curious to know how maybe you're connecting the dots. Like, the way I'm connecting the dots is going from A to B to C, but it feels like you're taking a different path. And I want to learn more about how you arrived at that conclusion. And I feel like we don't see a lot of that in today's day. At least, I feel like we see people who want to engage with others who are very similar minded to them. So I think that can be a great exercise, not just for nurturing your own curiosity, but also I think it can really uphold, relationships between people, and really, help people come together during difficult times.
Got it. Yeah. Yeah. So basically, you're saying start with small novelty, right? Which, like, change the food that you eat, or music, movies. Like, this will get your brain used to seeing things and
Yes.
experiencing things that are just different, right? Once you're in that kind of narrow-minded way of thinking, it can be really difficult to get away with, or get away from, because as human beings we want comfort and we want to be stable, right?
Yes.
So once we get away from that, we feel uncomfortable. So that's another huge problem. And then you mentioned this idea of being in an echo chamber, right? Which is really true. People tend to have like a certain friend group, and even on social media, the algorithms will give you what you want to
Hmm.
see, right? So if you're watching a certain type of video, for example, with politics, as you mentioned, you'll only see those kind of people give their opinion over and over and over again, and you won't see the other side, right? And as you mentioned, if you really want to get to know, I guess, or if you want to become more open-minded, like you have to start with thinking, why do people think like that,
Yeah.
right? And most people are not as sinister as you think. I mean, of course, there are bad people in the world, but most people, I mean, yes, people are flawed, again, across the board, but people in general are not sinister. Like, there's a reason why they think the way they think. And something that I read a long time ago was, if you truly understand a person, you can't hate them, right? You might not
Yeah.
agree, but you can't hate them, right? Because you can actually understand that thought process, and then you can go from there.
Yeah, I
So,
love that.
yeah, exactly. Now, again, when it comes down to being more open minded and solving problems, you mentioned that with intelligence and financial security, those are things that people get valued on. But again, those can be built based on questions that you ask yourself, right? Which kind of goes on to the next point of using your curiosity as some like mirror. Like you mentioned, use your curiosity as a mirror, right? Which is a pretty interesting concept that you talk about. So can you go a bit deeper on that and tell us why it's important to use your curiosity as a mirror, and like what do you really mean by that?
Hmm. So
Mm-hmm.
I think it can be really helpful for people to start tracking the things that they're curious about. And, oftentimes that can be very revealing in terms of, it can speak to maybe somebody's fears. Maybe somebody's really fearful of something. And so they become insatiably curious about it. Let's say somebody is fearful of safety issues. And so they find themselves watching a lot of crime, like true drama crime shows. Let's say that somebody's curiosity, they reflect on why they're curious, and it leads to maybe things that their desires that are going unmet, and so those unmet desires are like peeking in through the things that they're curious about. So I think it can be very revealing when you start to say, well, I'm asking all of these questions, or maybe I'm watching these shows, or I have this craving to know more about this content, but why? Let's say, for example, just going back to the idea of politics, let's say
Yeah.
somebody identifies with a certain political affiliation, but they are constantly wanting to watch political debates, and and of course those can be really stimulating, and they can be really rich, and they can also be very they can confirm what people's values are, but maybe somebody is starting to question their political beliefs, and they're exercising that curiosity by watching a lot of political debates. So I think it can be really interesting to prop up that mirror and say, I feel like this is a pattern that I'm gravitating to. These are the questions that I tend to like be embracing and bringing into my life. Why is that the case? So it's almost like a meta analysis. It's questioning the questions that you're asking others, or you're asking of yourself, or you're presenting existentially to the world itself.
Hmm. Yeah, exactly. So you tend to just become wiser on the
Hmm.
inside, right? And like, um, who's that person that had the quote that goes like, "The beginning of all wisdom is to know yourself."
Mm. Yeah, I'm
It's
drawing
a
a blank.
philosopher. I forgot their
Yes.
name. It might be Socrates. It might be Socrates. But like it, yeah, that's exactly something that people tend to kind of lose. And for me, it's been pretty interesting to see because like 10, 12 years ago when I was a kid, it seemed like the adults were much more kind of normal. You know what I mean? Like they were
Hmm.
more open minded and more civil, but they've kind of lost that as time goes on, right? And then, you know, as we spoke about a bit earlier, this idea of being in this echo chamber. When you watch one type of content over and over and over again, and nowadays it's like overly sensationalized, right? So when it's overly sensationalized, it can really stimulate you emotionally to the point where again you're not even willing to listen to the other side, which you can see quite a bit if you watch many debates. Obviously, you're from the U.S., right?
Hmm.
Yeah, so obviously it's heated. I mean, the U.S. has kind of had that issue. I guess probably over the past 10, 12 years.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, again, so if people again have found themselves in that place where they've been too emotionally stimulated, how do they unravel that? Because again, like it can be hard to be curious when you're too emotionally stimulated, right? So is there a way to get rid of that, or is it just something that you have to start with again, by being more curious with the small things, which again lead to the bigger things?
Well, I'll circle back to something that you just said, which I found really interesting. Sometimes you can start with the observations, excuse me, the observations that you make in life. So you just said something that was really compelling to me. You said 10 or 12 years ago when you were a kid, you
Yeah,
noticed that adults seemed to be different than they are now. And it sounds like maybe you thought they were more like stable than they are now. And
yeah,
so
yeah.
that is a really fascinating observation. So I would, if I were maybe having a conversation with you, I would pause there and say, well, why? Why do you think? What are some theories? Obviously, you yourself are different. When you go from being a child to an adult, you see things differently. But are there any other factors that could contribute to that observation? Like, what do you think? And so, we all as human beings in our day-to-day lives make those kinds of observations. So pushing the pause button and saying, well, that is a really intriguing observation. Why could that be the case? And so maybe you start reflecting with your own ideas. Maybe that curiosity lends itself to asking others, well, this is my observation. What do you think? Have you noticed something similar? What are some theories that you have to describe this phenomenon?
Hmm. Yeah. Oh, like, are you asking me, or is
Well,
just
well, even I think so. If I was talking to you outside of this podcast, those were
Yeah,
some things that I might present back to you, and I would encourage
yeah.
the viewers to also maybe start unpacking those observations. So we all make those observations in our day to day, and when we start kind of peeling back the layers of the onion to figure out, well, why could that be the case? And maybe there's not a concrete answer, but we still are engaging with that dialogue. And I think that engaging in that dialogue really taps into our curiosity.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, on my end, like from what I've witnessed, is that the adults weren't as like emotionally charged when it came to. I mean, politics has always been this really emotional space, right? It's probably the most emotional space because again, it really has a connection with pretty much everyone, because
Mm-hmm.
it kind of has an effect on your life, right? But people were much more civil. Like they never really kind of painted the other side as evil or stupid, right? But like now, it's like one side paints the other as evil, the other one paints the other as stupid. It's just like it's so unhealthy. So I can only imagine like if I was, for example, 14, 16 years old now, like you wouldn't really know how to have a civil conversation because all the models are just yelling at each other and insulting
Mm-hmm.
each other, and it's just like it's pretty concerning because again, kids just copy the adults, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
that's how kids learn, right? So whatever society is putting in front of them, they just become that. So I mean, it's not as bad as it once was. I mean, again, going back to I guess the U.S., like there's always something interesting happening there, right? But yeah, I mean, to really overcome that, I believe, as you mentioned, you have to become more curious, which is why I wanted to have this, like this conversation with you, because I think if you become more curious, like more genuinely curious, you can break away from that, right? And
Mm-hmm.
not just open your mind up to people that want to emotionally stimulate you and keep you in that one echo chamber. Like you have to be willing to look at both sides. And once you understand them, it just becomes clear why people believe what they believe. Oftentimes it comes down to their own life experiences, certain things that they were raised on, even like, their own values and stuff like that, their goals, their dreams. Like there's so many different moving parts that you have to look at. It's not just like, oh, they're stupid, he's a bad person. Like that's not really how it works, right? So hopefully that shift starts to, become more prominent, but it's definitely something that I've noticed just watching the adults, like as I went through my teenage years and, like my early 20s. It's been pretty interesting. So So
Yeah,
I
and
guess
I
that's my
love
observation with that.
and
Yeah.
I love how observant you are. I agree with your observation,
Yeah.
but I see so much curiosity and so much depth in your observation. So I see
Hmm.
you kind of wondering what's different from when I was a kid to now, A, so the why, as well as what's the solution, like, or you're observing the impact that it has on today's youth, as well as maybe the question after that, what can we do about it? So there's a lot
Hmm.
of questions. I think the first part of being curious is you're making some sort of observation, and then you're really kind of delving beneath the surface and digging deep. And just in that observation right there, so many questions spring about in terms of,
Hmm.
the why and the how, and the what can we do. So I think that's really interesting, and I said it at the beginning, and I really want to just verify that I really appreciate your curiosity.
Yeah, yeah, no problem. And then, that's why these kind of podcasts tend to get more and more important. Like if you look at, the size of, I guess, some mainstream podcasts, they're just as big as some of the mainstream news channels, right? And
Mm-hmm.
it's because normally when you're on a podcast, you get people that aren't, I mean, in general, like they're not trying to feed you some
Yes.
nonsense, right? And it's much longer. It's
Right.
like a 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour conversation, 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour conversation, which actually allows you to hear what they're saying. It's not a 5 minute clip or,
Yes.
a 2 minute clip like that. That's the problem, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't give people depth. And
Yeah.
without depth, you just react. Like
Mm-hmm.
that's a huge problem. So if mainstream media doesn't really fix up on that front, they're gonna kind of lose the influence that they once had, right?
Yeah.
Like probably in your country, if you look at the U.S., the trust that people have in mainstream media is falling. It's not what it
Mm-hmm.
once was, right?
Yeah.
Like 20 years ago, mainstream media was the place to go, but people have kind of gone away from that because people are slowly starting to understand it's made to just get you to think in a certain way, not
Mm-hmm.
give you different ideas from across the
Mm-hmm.
board and then letting you come to a conclusion,
Yes.
right? The people aren't as stupid as I guess some of the people in mainstream media might think, right? Like your job is to give them the ideas and then they'll come to their own
Mm-hmm.
conclusion, and then based off of that, it is what it is, right? So yeah,
Yeah, yeah. What you're
exactly.
describing, the ideal that you're describing, is really inherently infused with curiosity. So when we stay on the
Hmm.
surface, when we have like very simplistic sound bites, that's not digging beneath the surface. What you're talking about in terms of, encouraging people to come to their own conclusions, like you're essentially encouraging people to maybe consolidate the data points that they have, engage their curiosity, and really, forge their own path forward. So what you're describing is essentially curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Okay, now when it comes to curiosity, people normally tend to pick it up based on some sort of stimulation, right? If you're not getting some sort of external stimulation, like you don't have anything to work with, right? Like you have to be able to see something and question it to become more curious. So if there were some different activities that you would really recommend to people if they want to become more curious in terms of asking questions, what would those activities be? Like what should they really expose their mind to so they actually have the intel that they need to become more deeper with their thinking and to just become more curious?
Mm-hmm. So I think that I mentioned before, like going to new places, traveling, going to new restaurants. So anything new, automatically you're engaging with your senses. Your mind is racing to like figure things out, and it's saturated with new colors, the new textures of life, the new your five senses are on overload, and that really is conducive
Mhm.
for manifesting that curious mind. And just as simply as talking to new people,
Yeah.
from person to person, every person is different. There's no like equation of the human mind. With each person you talk to, you're going to have a different set of values, you're going to have a different personality, you're going to have a different background. And so if you start really connecting with the community and the individuals in the community, and start looking at them as like wanting to know more about them, who they are, where did they come from. That can be a really good forum for, just stepping outside of your door. And, maybe people don't have the means to travel extensively, but they can start rubbing elbows with people in their community, maybe in a different way. Also, I think that people can engage with creative spaces, like maybe going to a museum. Oftentimes when people, let's say, go to a museum, I would say it increases the possibility of engaging with curious minds, like people who want to look to understand and know something, whether it's a piece of art, and really engage thoughtfully with a piece of art, or maybe it's a museum that chronicles historical milestones. But usually you're rubbing elbows with people who are in that like-minded space, and I think that curiosity breeds more curiosity. So the more you're engaging with people who are curious, the more it has kind of that contagious element. And so I think that can be really stimulating. So, any kind of maybe educational forum, like a university, like classes, extracurricular classes, like a, let's say, creative writing class or a political discussion class, or even, like I said, a museum or a library, like something that really kind of the natural essence of that institution is there to promote curiosity.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So basically, what you're saying is find something that you have an interest in and just really expose yourself to that world, right?
Yeah.
Like whether it's a museum or you're traveling, if you can, new food, and just try and use the five senses and talk to new people, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is one of the best things to do. Like it's really interesting if you talk to new people from across the board. It's like one of the best things because like you really get to see where people come from, which again makes you wiser. And then one of the things that I find really interesting about just leading with curiosity is that life tends to feel more exciting and it feels longer too. Like I'm not sure if you've really experienced that, but for me it's like when you constantly stack up like new experiences over and over and over again, that time period tends to feel longer, right? But if you're doing the same thing on a daily basis, like the same routine for 5 months in a row, like 5 months will go by and then you're like like time just flew by, right? But if you were to stack those 5 months with constant new experiences, like you'll notice that time just feels longer, and then that'll make you want to be more curious because like no one really wants time to just fly by, right? It's a scary it's a scary thing when it just
Yeah.
tends to fly by. So that's one thing that I really noticed about just leading with curiosity. So yeah.
And that is such an interesting observation. Actually, that's something that I never really thought of before, but you're absolutely
Mm-hmm.
right that
Mm-hmm.
you can, in some ways, kind of prolong the life experience, qualitatively
Yeah.
speaking, because
Yeah.
I'm thinking of the movie. Have you ever seen Groundhog Day, when the main character just wakes up and it's the same thing every day? And I feel like sometimes we have moments in life where it's like that, we get stuck in just that routine, and before you know it, it's
Mm-hmm.
like it's the next year already. But if we
Exactly.
are really immersing ourselves in novel experiences, we're just we're soaking it up so much that it almost is like time stands still. And because it's just so, we're so fascinated by it, and we're putting things under the microscope, we're not just letting things slip by.
Exactly. Now, on the contrary, now we did cover this slightly at the beginning, but if people want to really avoid this idea of losing their curiosity, what are some activities and mindsets that they should try and stay away from? Because again, like human beings are naturally really curious, right? Like you just lose it as you get older. So what are some activities and mindsets that people should be aware of if they want to make sure that they don't like lose this really important way of thinking if you want to actually enjoy life?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that one of the main instances that comes to my mind is rigid thinking. So you even were able to extract the quality that, oh, to be curious means that you're open-minded. Like those two go hand in hand. So it's almost like the antithesis of that is rigid thinking. So the opposite of open-mindedness is, rigidity. And so if you think of somebody who's very rigid in their mindset, maybe they're really, they're very impacted by the shoulds and should nots. So I should do this, I should not do that. And to some degree, we all have shoulds and should nots, and that can be a moral compass, and it can be meaningful. So I'm not saying completely abandon the moral compass, but what I mean is, if your shoulds and should nots are too restrictive, like the example I gave at the beginning, like I can't leave this job. I have a degree. Let's say somebody has a degree in accounting and they've been an accountant for 25 years, and they say, I just can't do it. Like what would the world think of me? What would my family think of me if I just up and quit my job and, did something that I was really passionate about? And not to say that everybody can indulge themselves, at every whim, but so being mindful of those things are important, but also not always being ruled by those shoulds and should nots, because I think that really can limit curiosity. So when you say, oh, I can't do that, I can't explore, I can't step outside of the box, then all of a sudden you're restricting the natural permeation of curiosity.
Exactly. And what you said was really interesting to me, because when I was, like a bit younger, my manager was 28 years old. Like I used to work at a bank, right? He was 28 years old, and he loved stand-up comedy, right? And he was actually good at it. Like he wanted to go down that path. So I told him, I'm like, you should actually look into that. Like, being in Toronto, you have all these different clubs that you can go to. Just go and do it, right? Start to build it up. And he said, oh, he's too old.
Mm-hmm.
At 28.
Right.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
And then even though, he was older than me, it still kind of confused me. I was like, but you're 28, right? Like it's so interesting how like the world makes people feel older as they get older, even in their late 20s. And that tends to completely kill any sort of, risk-taking ability or enthusiasm, which is key to being curious, right? Now, here's the thing. A lot of people will hear this and say, oh yeah, it's so much easier to do that when you're younger, right? Because when you're younger, you can kind of really be curious in a way that's random and kind of abstract, because you don't have various life responsibilities yet. You know what I mean? But as you get older, you have bills and certain things to take care of, which can really inhibit your ability to be curious, right? So what would you tell people who say, oh, that's just a waste of time, I'm more mature now, I'm an adult, like I have to kind of focus on what actually matters? Like, what would you tell to those people? Because I think that's a mindset that really stops people from actually living and making the right changes in their life.
Yes, I completely agree. And I do think I agree with you that, becoming embroiled by responsibilities, and it's like, well, I wish I had time to daydream and be curious about things and just sit around and think. So I do think that we kind of view those as polarities. And so what I would encourage people to do is find maybe a metaphor that resonates with them. I'm really into metaphors as a way for understanding ourselves and understanding human behavior. And so one metaphor that comes to my mind is viewing curiosity like a body of water. So imagine curiosity is, let's say, a river, running downstream. And, you don't want the river to get out of control, and you want to have some parameters. You want, let's say there's like a dam, or there's, an embankment to, keep the river from overflowing into the nearby town. So if you view curiosity like a river, then you can say, of course, I'm going to have some parameters. Maybe, I have to hunker down and I have to be productive in my 9-to-5 job. And after work, I have to, take the kids to soccer practice, and I have to make dinner and so forth. Yeah. But I also don't want to stymie that flow of thought and that flow of river. So maybe even like chunking out time, like, once I get the family to bed, or once I'm done with my chores for the day, I'm going to give myself like 15 minutes just to kind of openly daydream and openly reflect on things, or maybe put pen to paper and just, in an unrestricted way, start journaling and remove like the rules, like the grammar rules and the shoulds and should nots. Like this isn't a quality piece of writing, remove all of that and just have that let that river flow very freely, but have those constraints at play so that you feel like, it's not toppling over your responsibilities and you're not maybe being too indulgent.
Got it. Okay, so if people, for example, if we're talking about changing jobs, because I guess that's one of the main things that people kind of think about when it comes down to being curious, or being curious. Because if you're not curious, and you just kind of go with the flow, you might just end up in a job that, as you mentioned, you just kind of stick with it for the sake of it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you were to, I guess, give people questions that they could ask themselves if they want to, I guess, go in the right direction, and again, not be too random. And then I know it might kind of go against what you're saying, because you're saying just view it as a body of water, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I guess if people want to be efficient, they kind of want to ask questions that lead them down the right track in the first place, so they're not wasting time doing things that are taking away from actually getting to where they want to be. So, like, what are some questions that people can start asking themselves if they want to move down that right direction, and be more efficient, rather than wasting time doing things that just aren't going to help them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good question. And I would say, based on the situation that they're putting under the microscope, might help inform what those questions look like. So let's say with the job, you mentioned wanting to maybe focus on job change, and that does feel really scary because so much of our security and our ability to navigate life relies on maybe the income that we have and maybe our health insurance for those of us, at least in the U.S., that is the case. So, well, not across the board, but for many people.
Yeah.
And so it feels scary, like, oh gosh, all of a sudden I'm going to abandon that. So maybe you can cater or tweak your questions and your curiosity about looking at what that might look like. Okay, if I change jobs, what's it going to look like in the immediate right now? And maybe it will be really disruptive initially. But what if I zoom forward and I look at it in different time periods? What if I look at it now and look at my life in a year from now, in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now? Now, what if I switch gears and I look at staying in the same job and I look at it right now versus 1 year versus 5 years versus 10 years. And so sometimes doing those, that comparative
Yeah.
analysis can be really interesting because let's say, for example, if you look at all of those different time orientations, maybe what you find is, okay, if I change jobs right now, my life will be super, super messy. But in the future, I'm going to be so much happier versus the exact opposite will be true. If I stay at this job, I'll be stable for now. It won't unearth this can of worms, but I'm going to be miserable when I think of myself in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years from now. So sometimes like zooming in and out of like time orientations can help give insight into, especially if you're looking at a major life shift.
Yeah, that's something that I really agree with, because oftentimes as an adult, having this long-term goal or long-term ambition or some sort of a vision, like, it allows you to let your curiosity go wild in that direction,
Mm-hmm.
right? So now, like, you're actually exercising this concept of like asking questions and trying to find a way while giving yourself some direction, right? Because
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that's one of the major changes that I believe happens. Because when you're a kid, like, no one really cares, or like, you're just being a kid, right? Like, you're just kind of
Mm-hmm.
floating around and doing your thing. As an adult, having that long-term thinking is extremely important. Now, obviously we're slowly coming to an end here, but
Mm-hmm.
I guess just to end off, like, what would you really recommend that people start to be more curious about if they want to enjoy life more, and be more efficient and just be more fulfilled? Like, where should they start? Obviously we talked about jobs and your career, which is extremely important. What other areas should people start with, again, as an adult, if you want to give your sense of curiosity that vision and clarity that it needs to be efficient?
Mm-hmm. I'm actually going to circle back to something that I was inspired by your line of thinking. And I'm going to encourage people to do what you just did in terms of start taking in the world like we all do, making those observations, but now all of a sudden flip them over and start asking why. So for example, you made the
Yeah.
observation, adults are different now. Okay, whatever somebody's observation is, pause. Now let's flip it over. And why could that be the case? Even something like maybe somebody notices like these are my values, these are my beliefs. Okay, that's great. Pause. well, why? Where did you get those values? Where did you get
Yeah.
those beliefs? Did they really come from you? Did they come from maybe your family, or did they come from an experience you had, or were they born out of tragedy or trauma, or were they born out of happiness? You know what I mean? So pushing the pause button on all of the numerous infinite amount of observations we're always constantly making, and really exploring kind of the why behind them, and what's behind the curtain.
Yeah, that's really important because as you get older, if you really want to try and avoid the slave mind, just doing what everyone else told you to do, one of the best ways is to question everything, right? Because
Yes.
when you start to question, when you start to question everything, now you can find out, okay, wait, no, what's actually important to me, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then if you start that early in the process, obviously, if you're at a certain age, I mean, we can't go back in time, right? But
Mm-hmm.
questioning everything allows you to really break the mold and start figuring out what's important to you rather than just doing what you were told to do, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's a pattern that people tend to really fall into, just doing what they're told, and they end up in a place where they're lost, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because they're not even living a life that they want to live, which is really dangerous. And even like sometimes I see that happening now as well. But it's so interesting how just the I guess corporate world and even what people tell you, it just really gets in that way of asking why,
Mm-hmm.
and also how. I think how is also really
Yes.
important too, right? Because like that actually gives you the path that you need to move forward and
Mm-hmm.
solve problems instead of just kind of letting your mind roam free, which is important. But at the end of the day, we want solutions too, right? So the why and the how is extremely important, especially as an adult.
Yeah, I could
So
not agree more. I agree
yeah.
wholeheartedly, again, with everything that you said.
Thank you. Well, Dr. Vejar, this was such a great episode. Thank you so much. I really, like enjoyed this concept of talking about curiosity because it's extremely important. And then, as you talk about in your blog post, it is one of the main things that people have to really adopt when it comes down to living that fulfilling life that we all want to live, right? So, yeah, if people want to go and find your work, where would you go and tell them to go?
So they can find me at the Psychology Today blog post, which is where you found me, and I'm so happy that
Yeah.
we were able to connect. Also, I am a professor at Lebanon Valley College in Pennsylvania, within the United States. I also have a website, a therapy website. It's called theflippedscript.com, where folks can find me. And within that, I have information about my therapy practice. I also have a YouTube blog under the same title, The Flip Script.
God, yeah, no problem. If you send me all those links, I will post it down below, and people can go and check it out if need be.
Wonderful. Well,
Okay then.
thank you so much.
No problem, no problem. This is really fun. Hey, thank you so much, and hopefully we can do it again. We
I
can look
hope
into any other topic that
so.
you do, and we can do it again. Yeah.
This was really fun
Okay.
for me too.
It was great. It was great. Thank you so much. Hey, you have a great day, and yeah, please take care.
Thanks. You too. Take care.
No problem. No problem.